For today's video, I'm going to be sharing some helpful tips for anyone who's thinking about getting a 40 gallon or 150 litre aquarium. If you're familiar with my channel, you may know that I usually focus on the nano tank side of things, so I am going to be focusing on people who are either looking to upgrade from a smaller tank to a 40 gallon, or people who are brand new to the hobby and looking at a 40 gallon as their brand new first tank. So the first tip is to choose the right equipment from the very start. Now I know that this one might sound obvious, but there's a few important things to consider here. For starters, most equipment for a 40 gallon tank is going to be more expensive than what you'd use in a nano tank, but there's no need to fall into the trap of thinking you need to buy the most expensive gear available. A good example is my Fluval FX2 canister filter that I run on my 40 gallon tank. Now it is an excellent filter and I have no complaints at all on its performance, but in all honesty I do think that something like an All Pond Solutions HOB hang-on back canister filter could easily hold that cycle on the tank. I actually bought the FX2 with a larger tank setup in mind before settling on the nano tank side of the hobby, but I often see other people rushing in to buy high-end canister filters when you really don't need one. Smaller hang-on back canister filters are not only far cheaper, but in my experience they are also far easier to clean and maintain, with their only real downside being that this specific variety can be difficult to find outside of Europe. Lighting is another area where people often overspend when upgrading to a larger tank. But premium price point lighting is usually not necessary for a low-tech tank like my 40 gallon, and I'm running a Haiger 957 and a Night Crew C10 light on this, and all of the plants are thriving. Another great option that I use on a lot of my other tanks is the Seaoura SR801, which is an excellent piece of equipment that's usually cheaper than the other two models. All of those lights are far cheaper than anything from the Chihiros or ADA or Twin Star lines, and in my opinion, for a low-tech tank that's not injecting CO2 and adding a lot of liquid fertilizers to the tank, they will easily meet most people's needs. One area where I personally wouldn't cut corners is with the heater for my aquariums. Thankfully, I've never personally experienced a heater failure, but I've heard too many horror stories of heaters breaking and overheating the tank, causing major losses. I'm currently using a Fluval T Series heater on my 40 gallon and it's been rock solid, and I've never had a problem with this one or any of the other Fluval T Series that I use, and it's the same for my Haiger heaters too. But as a general rule, you'll want a heater that provides 1 watt of power per litre of water in the aquarium, so for a 40 gallon tank which is around 150 litres, you're going to be aiming for a heater that has around 150 watts of power. If you do decide to go with a more budget friendly heater, I'd recommend that you try and get yourself some type of thermometer with a built-in alarm. The Seaoura SR801 is a fantastic option and it's very accurate on all of my tanks, and it also lets you set a high and low temperature range that will alert you if the temperature goes out of these bounds. Here's a quick example of what the alarm sounds like if the temperature is not within the parameters that you set. So as you can tell, it definitely grabs your attention, letting you know that there's a problem with that tank so you can take action as quickly as possible and save your fish. When it comes to hardscape, bigger tanks often mean more materials being used, but you don't need to spend a fortune to get a great looking tank. For my 40 gallon, I've kept things as budget friendly as possible and stuck with lava rock and spiderwood because they are two of the cheapest options available and you can find them in a wide range of shops. Now there's a bunch of variables at play for substrate, so I will cover that in more detail later in the video, but my key point for this section is that you don't need to get the most expensive equipment on the market to make your 40 gallon tank work. Next, I want to talk about where you should place your aquarium, because larger tanks like a 40 gallon weigh significantly more than nano tanks, and this can cause some serious issues if you're not careful. Here's a photograph of my old 29 gallon setup which I had sitting on some random spare bench I had lying around. As you can see, there's a slight bend starting to form in the table that clearly shows it's starting to give way, and I honestly think if I tried my 40 gallon on this particular table it would have just collapsed. These days I only use heavy duty storage racks and heavy duty workbenches for my aquarium stands, and they are built to support a lot of weight, making them a lot safer. Personally, I follow a rule of thumb that I learned from the Green Aqua channel, where you aim for a stand that can support double your tank's volume in litres measured in kilograms. So for a 40 gallon tank which is roughly 150 litres, you'll want a bench or stand that can hold at least 300 kilograms. This accounts for the weight of your actual aquarium, the water, the hardscape, substrate, accessories, and basically everything else that goes into an aquarium. I'm currently using this exact guideline across all of my aquariums and I've never once had an issue. Tank placement also becomes a more important issue with larger setups. Unlike nano tanks that are small and light enough for you to drain the water and then move them as required, a 40 gallon is an absolute pain to move once it's set up. So here are some things that you should think about before you actually set your tank up. Try and make sure that it's placed as close to a power outlet as possible so you have easy access to power. Take a little bit of time to plan your cable management and ideally label up your plugs with some sticky tape letting you know what's for your light, your heater, your filter and anything else. Try to place the tank out of direct sunlight if possible to help reduce algae growth in the aquarium. And finally, try to avoid placing it in high trafficked areas of your home where it might get bumped or knocked into on a regular basis. Taking that extra bit of time at the start of your setup to plan around things like this can drastically improve your success rate further down the line. The next thing that I want to cover is actually stocking your tank, because I've personally run into some issues with what I added to my 40 gallon and I know that a bunch of other people have done the same. When I first set this tank up, I added pearl gourami as the centerpiece fish. But it didn't take long for them to start breeding and getting territorial, which led to some aggressive behaviour towards their tank mates. In the end, I had to rehome them to a friend who has a dedicated pearl gourami tank, but not everyone has that possibility, so it is important to try and plan your stocking. Another example is with my Corydoras and Harlequin rasboras, as they breed for most of the year in this particular setup, which leads to increased activity levels which scare my tetras. During the time periods when they are breeding, my tetras usually just retreat into the plant cover and stay away from everything else. Now, some of these things you can only learn from experience, but thankfully there is an absolute ton of content online these days to help you. A lot of people share their specific stocking setups for their tanks and talk about how all of the different fish interact with each other, which can be very helpful when planning your tank. Although it can be a debated topic, mixing hard water species like guppies with soft water species like neon tetras can potentially be problematic, especially if your tap water isn't close to neutral or around 7.0 pH. Temperature compatibility is another often overlooked factor that may cause issues in your tank. Try to avoid mixing tropical and temperate species in the same aquarium unless you're confident that they will be okay at the same temperature range. Looking back, it seems obvious, but I specifically asked for male and female pearl gourami, overlooking the fact that if I just stuck with females, I probably wouldn't have had any problems with aggression. On the other hand, sticking with male guppies can be a great option if you want to add a lot of colour and movement to your tank without the risk of overpopulation, because guppies are prolific breeders. On top of that, the individual personalities of certain fish species also play a big role in how everything's going to come together in your tank. For example, betta fish have a reputation for being aggressive, but not all of them actually are. I've definitely had one betta that lived up to the stereotype, but I had another one who was an absolute sweetheart and he acted like the shrimp in his tank with his little friends that he had to look after. One of my good friends has a betta in his community tank with a bunch of other species, and his betta just ignores everyone and does his own thing. So my advice would be to pay attention to creators who actually show the species that they are talking about in their videos to show they've actually kept them, rather than people who are just reading their Wikipedia page. Another great resource that I personally use on a regular basis is Seriously Fish, that tends to have accurate information with links to the scientific sources at the bottom of each page. So moving on, and we get to plants for 40-gallon tanks, and one of the first things that you'll notice, especially if you are upgrading from nano tanks, is that you're generally going to be scaling everything up. For example, instead of choosing Anubias nana or petite, you might want to go with larger varieties like Anubias coffeefolia or Anubias barteri that better match the portions of the 40-gallon tank. Likewise, instead of smaller cryptococcine species like Cryptalbida or Cryptnovellii, you might want to consider something like Cryptococcine eusteriana, which is a lot larger. And rather than the smaller compact sword plants like Echinodorus tropica, you might want to go with something like Echinodorus cordifolius fluitans or Echinodorus belleri that are a far larger plant that will look better in a 40-gallon tank. The best thing is, provided you stick with easy category plants, you can usually mix and match a wide variety of species in your tank without too many issues. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you start to integrate medium and advanced category plants, you may have issues without having the right setup. For example, some of those plants do require high-powered expensive lighting, CO2 injection and supplemental fertilizers to thrive. Now that can work really well if you've done your research and built your tank around it, but if you're running a low-tech setup like mine with moderate lighting, no CO2 and no liquid fertilizers, it is usually best to stick with easy plants. Another often overlooked factor to consider is the actual maintenance requirements of these plants too. In general, plants like Cryptococcines, Anubias, Echinodorus and Java fern are slow grown and require minimal maintenance, so they are great for low maintenance tanks. Moving up from there, you get to stem plants like Rotala, Hygrophila, Limnophila and Ludwigia that tend to grow faster and usually need trimming once or twice per month depending on your setup. And then moving up from there again, you get to the fast-grown stolon plants like Vallisneria, which grow both vertically and spread horizontally via their runners and can technically double your maintenance if you need to control the area of the tank they are in and stop them spreading out with their runners. Personally, I actually enjoy aquarium maintenance and I see it as a break from staring at a screen all day, but I do know a lot of people are specifically looking for low maintenance setups, so keep an eye on what your plants actually require. Next up is algae management, and honestly I think this is one of the most common questions that I get whenever I talk about 29-gallon or 40-gallon tanks. In my opinion, a big part of the problem comes from the higher stocking levels and larger amount of food being added to the tank each day, which naturally leads to higher excess nutrient levels. This not only fuels plant growth, but if there's extra nutrients available in the water the plants aren't using, it can also cause algae to grow too. A great way to help control this is by using fast-grown stem and floating plants, as they soak up a lot of the extra nutrients in your tank and outcompete algae. Now, a lot of people, including myself at one point, used to think that you can just rely on standard test kits to monitor nitrogen levels such as your ammonia, nitrite and nitrate and keep them as low as possible to avoid algae. But as it turns out, that's not always the case, and as I explained in a video I link in the description where I shared how I got rid of blackbeard algae in my 40-gallon tank, phosphate levels in your aquarium can end up being a serious issue. For my 40-gallon, it did seem that the decaying organic matter in the filter was releasing a lot of phosphate into the tank water, which is something that standard test kits don't directly test for unless you get the specific one for phosphate. Once I started doing deep cleans on my filter every month, the phosphate levels dropped quickly and the algae disappeared without needing to adjust my lighting or reduce the amount of food I added to the tank each day. So yeah, don't underestimate the importance of proper filter maintenance for your larger tank setups, as well as using fast-growing plants to manage nutrients. The next tip is to try and invest in some kind of auto water change system as early as possible if your budget allows. There's quite a few options on the market now, and mine is just a cheap budget-friendly version, but it works perfectly fine. I used the classic bucket and siphon method for around 6 months after getting my 40-gallon tank, but in all honesty it just takes up so much time even when you're doing a small partial water change. With one of these auto water change systems, you simply hook it up to your tap, place the other end in your tank and let it do the hard part by draining a lot of the water for you quickly. Once you've removed the desired amount of water, you flip the valve and start refilling the tank with fresh water just as fast. In my experience, it's so much quicker and requires far less effort compared to the bucket and siphon method, and it's definitely worth the price of the actual system. The good news is that more and more brands are starting to release their own versions of these, so prices have been dropping recently and there's some great budget-friendly options out there. But it is worth noting that you should check that the actual connectors included with the system you're considering buying will fit to your tap. One important thing to remember when using this type of water change system is when you're refilling, try and balance your hot and cold tap water so the temperature going back into your tank matches what your fish are used to. This helps to prevent temperature shock and keep your fish happy and stress-free during your water changes. Finally, I want to talk about substrate options because there's quite a few different factors to consider. In my 40-gallon, I went with Fluval Stratum Aqua Soil, but I recently discovered, unlike most aquarium products, it's actually far more expensive over in the United States than here in Europe, which can really drive up your costs if you live on the other side of the Atlantic. One popular method to cut your costs is to only use aqua soil in the background of your tank where most of your rooted plants will go, and then use a cheaper sand or gravel in the foreground. Another budget-friendly option is the cap dirt method, and I personally think that it's pretty straightforward if you have a similar personality to mine and you really enjoy doing research and deep diving on topics, but there is a lot to take in. Because of this, if you're not willing to do a lot of research, then I probably wouldn't recommend this, because there are a few things like ammonia spikes, mudding and anaerobic pockets that you have to know about before you really get into the method. If you're looking for something that's very, very simple and also quite budget friendly, then a completely inert substrate like gravel or sand, which I'm currently using in my tank with the undergravel filter, can work well. In my opinion, it's a great option for beginners, especially people who don't want to do a ton of research on their substrate. Now, I know the plants in this tank look a bit rough at the moment, but this is a room temperature setup and temperatures were pretty low until recently, and on top of that, it is a new tank setup. There's also the bare bottom route where you don't use any substrate at all, and I haven't tried that myself, but to be honest, it's just not my style visually. The main point that I want to get across is that you don't need to spend a fortune on expensive aqua soil if you don't want to, and there's plenty of other options out there where you can successfully grow plants in larger tanks. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful and gave you some tips that you can use for your own 40-gallon aquarium and avoid some of the problems that I had. Thanks for watching the video, have a good day and good luck with your new 40-gallon tank.